Return of the Mount Hua Sect, Chapter 195. Such a big figure has suddenly appeared. Chongmyung didn't take his eyes off from the sleeves of Tanggunak, which were swollen as if they would burst. The soul-chasing dagger and the 12th dagger. Chongmyung knew how terrifying the combined power of those two were. How many people of the demonic sect had those daggers taken down? The soul-chasing dagger, which had been the most reliable tool in supporting Chongmyung in his past life, was now aiming for Chongmyung's neck. Of course, it isn't on that level yet though. Tangbo, the man who made the throwing daggers and created his own martial arts. The level of martial arts that man had reached was unparalleled in the history of the Tang family. That was who he was. But now the person in front of him was the Poison King. He could use all the martial arts of the Tang family, but he wasn't that proficient in it. So his throwing blades couldn't be compared to the ones he had witnessed in the past. The problem was that Chongmyung also wasn't anywhere close to where he was in his past life in terms of strength. Compared to the enormous difference between the Plum Blossom Sword Saint and Mount Hua's Divine Dragon, it was no exaggeration to say that the difference between the dagger's skill level and his power right now was as big as a mountain. If it hits, I really will die. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek. There was a reason to be nervous. The biggest drawback of the throwing blades was that it is difficult to recover the ones that were thrown. In other words, even if Tanggunak had no intention of killing Chongmyung, he couldn't stop the blades from hitting him. Phew! After letting out a long breath, Chongmyung clenched his hand that was holding the sword. And in that moment, pat! 3 throwing blades slashed through the air. One was coming directly at him, and the other 2 were rotating towards him from the sides. The speed of the ones rotating were much faster than the ones coming straight for him. As a result, the 3 reached Chongmyung simultaneously. Tuh! Chongmyung groaned as he stretched his sword forward. It shook. The tip of the sword shook. Soon, his sword began to vibrate more slowly, and then it looked like the sword had divided into multiple swords and soon covered the air. Sword barrier. Kang kang kang. The 3 throwing blades, which were aimed at him, couldn't break past his defense and bounced off. Tanggunak, who had thought this would be the end, performed his next move without delay. It was 5 this time. Swish! 5 knives were thrown at Chongmyung at different speeds. It was significantly slower than the 3 before, but they still had the same force and power behind them. Kang! The first collided with the sword barrier Chongmyung had set up. He felt like his wrist would break from the impact. Kang! The second dagger pushed his sword back. Chongmyung felt his entire body shake. Kang! The third created a huge gap in the sword barrier. Kang! The fourth destroyed it completely. Swish! The fifth was approaching Chongmyung with the intention to kill. Ugh! Chongmyung stretched out the sword after he recovered again. At the tip of the sword, a small bud bloomed. A plum blossom. Dozens of plum blossoms bloomed in an instant and wrapped around the throwing blades which flew in. Softness that controls hardness. Tanggunak was a little shocked, but regardless of what he was feeling, his hands were reaching so that he could continue with the next attack. Pah! Before Chongmyung could subdue the 5th one, Tanggunak was ready to throw the next knife, and the dagger thrown this time didn't have any huge strength behind it. It was just speed. The dagger, which disappeared upon releasing, moved through the air and appeared right in front of Chongmyung. Despite being aware of this, Chongmyung couldn't help but be a bit surprised. Ah! Chongmyung desperately twisted his body. The throwing blade slightly grazed Chongmyung's chest and passed by while the 5th one, which hadn't been taken down yet, pierced into Chongmyung's thigh. Pak! After spinning in the air for a while, Chongmyung came back to the ground and pressed the blood points of his leg to stop the bleeding. Of course, he wasn't going to die because of this wound. However, if he shed a lot of blood, his stamina would drop, and if that happened, he would lose his concentration. Having fought in endless battles all his life, Chongmyung knew the best way to hold onto his body so that it could live through dire situations. He avoided it. Meanwhile, Tanggenak was looking at Chongmyung as if he couldn't understand what was happening. He could understand the guy managing to block up the consecutive 5 lightning. However, the subsequent casting of the life-chasing flash wasn't something that a rising star could avoid. And this disciple of Mount Hua had avoided it perfectly. And to use softness to ease the power of the throwing blade. A disciple of Mount Hua. That meant that this guy's sword wasn't just bound to the teachings of Mount Hua. And that meant that he would grow stronger. No, he was already strong. For attacks! While Tanggenak was still in shock, Chongmyung stood and looked at him. You have 6 moves left. Tanggenak stretched his hand forward, and then he moved his hand up and then down. All of the throwing blades, which were on the floor, were retrieved back into his sleeve. Tanggenak caressed his knives and hummed. There was a thought in his mind. 6 moves. It wasn't that he was worried about not being able to take down Chongmyung. If the purpose of this was to prove that he was the best in the world of the future generation, then this child has already accomplished his purpose. This child had amazing talent within him. He couldn't even imagine other people of the same age as Chongmyung being able to defeat this child. It probably won't take a long time for this child to go beyond the first sword of Mount Hua and be called as the first sword of the world. But his desire didn't die. I want to check further. Where the end for this child lay. He wanted to know what was hiding in the bottom of the well of this monster. Even if the results of his actions would possibly kill the strongest man in the future with his own hands. Creak. Once again, the throwing blades made the scratching noise. It doesn't matter. The basic desire of a Murim warrior to fight a strong opponent rose within the lord of the Tang family after many years. And 3 daggers were thrown swiftly. Chongmyung watched it with a stiff face. Here I go. Tuck. His feet hit the ground heavily. This time, he rushed towards the throwing blades. The closer the distance, the higher the power. And it was natural that something that is thrown loses power as the distance increases. But he couldn't be victorious if he moved back. This was Tanggenak's domain, and Chongmyung's sword wouldn't reach him now. Even if this was a spar for the sake of a test, if he didn't aim for victory in a battle which sought to take his life, it wouldn't make Chongmyung feel good. He had to take risks. The place to win is at the front, not the back. Kang kang kang. All 3 of the throwing blades were bounced away. Each time he hit a throwing blade, it felt like his wrist would shatter any moment. The body of Chongmyung wasn't strong enough to withstand the onslaught of the Poison King. Still, I have to endure it. All that was needed was to endure until the end of the spar, and then something will be realized. 5 attacks. Ta-ta. Chongmyung used the ground to propel himself forward and narrow the distance with Tanggenak. As if he was enjoying it, Tanggenak made a sound and his sleeves were spread to the side. Pang! And 7 throwing blades were shot at once. Chongmyung went wide-eyed as he looked at them. 7-star Soul Reaper. Tangbo's specialty. If the demonic sect members who were killed by this technique were gathered, their bodies could create a small mountain. Huh? Chongmyung, instead of backing down, threw himself at the 7 throwing blades. If he retreated to the back, it was the end. The 7 throwing blades were aiming for his soul. If he stepped back, he would get caught in the flow of the weapons and would have his throat pierced. Chongmyung lifted his body exactly 3 inches into the air and began to dodge them as skillfully as he could. For the first time, Tanggenak looked openly shocked as he saw the sight in front of him. To read the trajectory. If it had been Tangbo on the other side, Chongmyung, in his current form, couldn't have escaped from it. However, for Chongmyung, this was a martial art which he was too familiar with, as familiar as he was with Mount Hua's sword techniques. The 7 throwing blades passed by Chongmyung. Sak! Sak! The left arm, the side, and the right ankle. Those 3 places were cut and blood had fallen to the ground. But Chongmyung kept rushing towards Tanggenak without caring for his wound. 6 attacks! Tanggenak's face regained composure right away. Using his right hand, he collected the soul-chasing daggers. With his left hand, at the same time, he threw 5 of them at Chongmyung. Kwah! The soul-chasing daggers rotated at a formidable speed as they moved towards Chongmyung. This was something that Tangjan had shown the previous night against Jogul. However, this couldn't be compared to what they had seen before, as if proving the fact that this martial arts execution was different depending on who used it. The soul-chasing daggers that were released now couldn't be compared with Tangjan's by a long shot. These cannot be avoided. Chongmyung clenched his teeth. The 5 throwing blades were already coming for his body, and if he tried to dodge it and got caught, then it would be worse than just being pierced. Shak! Chongmyung's plum blossom sword swung in midair like a whip. At the same time, plum blossoms began to bloom. 1 blossom, 2 blossoms. The plum blossom multiplied in an instant, began to bloom endlessly, and covered the world. This. Tanggenak looked a little surprised. Plum blossoms. It looked like the entire world was filled with plum blossoms. There was an endless sea of it. Kwah! And the rotating soul-chasing daggers were digging into such a sea. Formidable power, enormous strength. Yet, the sea was embracing everything. Tanggenak's weapons fell to the floor, unable to break the waves of the plum blossoms. And Chongmyung, who rose through the sea of plum blossoms, moved towards Tanggenak. Blood was dripping from his lips. It was the price he had to pay for trying to receive the attack of Tanggenak by rapidly deploying the sword technique. 7 attacks! Chongmyung gulped the blood which was coming to his mouth and looked as calm as he could. Pang! At that moment, Chongmyung could see that the gap between the 2 was barely there, and Tanggenak didn't miss it either. A throwing blade moved for Chongmyung. I've been through this once before. Using his speed, Chongmyung jumped up and slammed the throwing blade to the ground with his sword. Kwang! At that moment, the eyes of Chongmyung opened wide in shock. Another throwing blade was right in front of it. The throwing blade looked like it couldn't be bounced off. Too late! He didn't have time to react. Chongmyung! His Taeyongs were all screaming and shrieking as they too realized what was happening. The throwing blade hit Chongmyung right in the face, and Chongmyung's body, which collided with the force of the throwing blade, fell back like a kite which had its string cut off.